You are a peasant in 14th century, and your neighbor's pig just destroyed your garden. Again, you're furious. Your turnips are ruined, your cabbages trampled, and that smug pig is now happily rolling in the mud like it just won the lottery. So what do? Do you have a stern conversation with your neighbor? Do you build a better fence? No. You take that pig to court, I'm not joking. You literally drag that pig into a courtroom, stand before a judge, and accuse it of criminal trespass. The pig gets a lawyer. There's a trial. Witnesses testify. And if found guilty, that pig could face execution. Welcome to the medieval justice system, where animals had legal rights, legal responsibilities, and could absolutely be sentenced to death for their crimes. But that's just the beginning of the absolutely bizarre, hilarious, and sometimes disturbing relationship medieval people had with animals. Because in the Middle Ages, animals weren't just livestock or pets. They were co-workers, criminals, saints, demons, medical equipment, and occasionally your dinner date. The medieval world was a place where a rooster could be burned at the stake for laying an egg, where beetles were excommunicated from the church, and where your doctor's best medical advice was to strap a live chicken to your face. Today, we're diving deep into the wild, weird, and often completely unhinged things medieval people did with animals. From animal trials that would make modern lawyers weep, to bizarre medical practices that involved more livestock than a petting zoo, to religious ceremonies where animals played starring roles. This is the story of how our ancestors interacted with the animal kingdom in ways that ranged from touching to terrifying to just plain bizarre. So buckle up. Things are about to get medieval. Part 1. When Animals Broke. The Law. Chapter 1. Animal trials were actually a thing. Let's start with perhaps the most insane legal practice in medieval history: putting animals on trial for crimes. And I'm not talking about a symbolic gesture or a superstitious ritual. I'm talking about full, formal legal proceedings, with all the pomp and circumstance of any human trial. Picture this. It's 1474 in Basel, Switzerland. A rooster has been accused of a heinous crime. What crime, you ask? Laying an egg. Yes, you read that correctly. A rooster allegedly laid an egg, which medieval people believed would hatch into a cockatrice, a legendary serpent monster that could kill you with a single glance. This was considered both a crime against nature and an act of sorcery. So what happened? The rooster was arrested. It was formally charged. It stood trial before a judge and jury. The prosecution presented its case, complete with the damning evidence: the egg itself. The defense attorney, and yes, the rooster had a defense attorney, argued that laying an egg was an involuntary act, and therefore the rooster couldn't be held criminally responsible. It was a compelling argument, the kind of argument that might have worked in a sane legal system. But this was medieval Basel. The rooster was found guilty. The sentence? Death by burning at the stake. The rooster and its egg were burned together in a public execution attended by crowds of citizens who apparently had nothing better to do that day. And this wasn't some isolated incident of medieval madness. Animal trials were shockingly common throughout Europe from the 13th to the 18th centuries. We have detailed records of hundreds of these cases. Pigs were the most frequently prosecuted animals, probably because they wandered freely through medieval towns and had an unfortunate habit of attacking children. But the list of animals that faced medieval justice reads like a demented zoo manifest. In 1386, a pig in Falaise, France was convicted of murdering a child by eating its face. The pig was sentenced to be hanged. But here's where it gets even weirder. The executioners dressed the pig in human clothes before the execution. They put a man's waistcoat and gloves on this pig, then led it to the gallows where it was hanged in the town square. The execution was attended by massive crowds, and the local authorities paid for the pig's outfit out of the public treasury. There are actual expense reports documenting the cost of tailoring human clothes to fit a pig for execution. In 1457, a sow and her 6 piglets were charged with murdering a 5-year-old boy in Savigny, France. The mother pig was found guilty and executed, but the piglets, they were acquitted due to their youth and the bad influence of their mother. The court literally ruled that the piglets couldn't be held fully responsible because they were corrupted by a bad parent. Medieval legal theory was wild. Insects and rodents got dragged into court too. In 1478, the rats of Autun, France, were formally charged with destroying the barley crop. The rats obviously didn't show up for their court date. So the defense attorney argued that his clients couldn't safely travel to court because the roads were filled with cats, which posed an imminent threat to his client's safety. The judge actually considered this argument. Seriously, a medieval judge sat in his courtroom and contemplated whether cats were a valid excuse for rats to skip their trial. In 1545, a group of weevils in Saint-Julien, France, were put on trial for damaging vineyards. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. Witnesses testified. Expert testimony was heard. The weevils were appointed a defense attorney who argued, and I quote, that the insects had as much right to eat as humans did, and that God had created vegetation for all living creatures, not just people. The prosecution countered that the weevils were agents of Satan sent to punish humans for their sins. The case went on so long that eventually the court reached a compromise. The weevils would be given their own plot of land outside the village where they could eat all the plants they wanted. In exchange, they had to leave the vineyards alone. A formal contract was drawn up. The problem, of course, was that weevils can't read and don't respect property law. So this solution was about as effective as you'd expect. But why? Why were medieval people putting animals on trial? It wasn't just superstition, though, that played a part. It was actually rooted in medieval legal philosophy. You see, medieval law was obsessed with order. Everything had to have its proper place in the cosmic hierarchy. When an animal committed a crime, it wasn't just breaking human law. It was disrupting the natural order ordained by God. By putting an animal on trial, medieval authorities were reaffirming that even creatures without reason were subject to divine law. The trials served as public demonstrations that justice applied to all creatures, that order would be maintained, and that humans were in control of God's creation. Plus, executing an animal that killed a human sent a message to other animals. Did medieval people think pigs would learn from watching their friends get hanged? Probably not, but they believed in maintaining social order through public punishment, regardless of whether the criminal could understand the lesson. There's also the fact that medieval legal systems loved procedures and formality. If you were going to punish an animal, you had to do it properly, with all the legal rituals and ceremonies. You couldn't just kill a pig that murdered someone. That would be vigilante justice. No, you had to arrest the pig, charge it, give it a fair trial, and then execute it according to law. Because even pigs had due process rights in the Middle Ages. Let that sink in. Chapter 2. When churches excommunicated animals. If animal trials weren't weird enough, medieval people also brought their beef with animals to church. Literally. When animals became pests or nuisances, communities would sometimes ask the church to excommunicate them. Yes, you read that correctly. Medieval churches would perform formal excommunication ceremonies for rats, locusts, caterpillars, and other crop-destroying creatures. Excommunication was serious business in medieval Christianity. It meant you were cut off from the church, denied sacraments, and basically condemned to hell. But medieval theologians had a problem. Could animals even be excommunicated? They didn't have souls in the traditional sense. They couldn't sin. They couldn't understand church doctrine. The solution: a legal framework that treated animal pests as agents of Satan or as divine punishment for human sins. If locusts were destroying your crops, it wasn't just bad luck. It was either God punishing your community for wickedness or Satan attacking you through his insect minions. Either way, the church could intervene. The process usually went like this. A community being plagued by pests would petition the church for help. The church would investigate, sometimes holding formal hearings to determine the extent of the problem. If the situation was deemed serious enough, the bishop would issue a formal citation, summoning the offending creatures to appear before an ecclesiastical court. Obviously, the rats or locusts or whatever didn't show up, so the church would appoint a defense attorney to represent the absent animals' interests. Yes, medieval churches appointed lawyers to defend rats. Let me repeat that. The Catholic Church appointed attorneys to represent rodents in ecclesiastical court. These lawyers would argue that their clients had a right to food, that God created plants for all creatures, and that the pests were just trying to survive. The prosecution, usually a church official, would counter-argue that the animals were causing unjust harm to humans, who had dominion over creation. They'd cite scripture, church law, and precedents from previous animal cases. These trials could last months, with multiple hearings, witness testimonies, and elaborate legal arguments. If the animals were found guilty, the bishop would issue a formal sentence of excommunication. This wasn't just symbolic. A priest would perform an actual excommunication ceremony, complete with prayers, curses, and the ringing of bells. The excommunication document would be read aloud, often in the infested fields themselves, condemning the creatures and ordering them to leave the area within a specified time period, usually 3 days. The curse would invoke the power of God, Jesus, the saints, and various angels to drive the pests away. It would declare the animals anathema, cut off from divine grace. Some curses got incredibly specific and creative. One excommunication of caterpillars commanded them, in the name of God, to depart the diocese, and threatened that if they didn't leave, they would be cursed with sterility, and their corpses would be prey to birds and beasts. Did it work? Well, sometimes the pests left, probably because of natural migration patterns, changing weather, or the natural life cycle of insect infestations. When this happened, it was treated as proof of the church's power and God's favor. The community would celebrate, the church would claim victory, and everyone would reinforce their belief that ecclesiastical curses worked. When the pests didn't leave, the church had an out. The community must still be sinning. The curse would only work if the people were righteous. So if the locusts stayed, clearly the townspeople needed to pray harder, repent more, and donate more money to the church. It was a perfect, unfalsifiable system. One of the most famous cases happened in 1478 in Lausanne, Switzerland. The community was being devastated by a plague of beetles that were destroying crops. The locals petitioned the church, which appointed a prosecutor and a defense attorney for the beetles. The case dragged on for weeks, with both sides presenting elaborate arguments about the rights of insects versus the needs of humans. Eventually, the judge reached a compromise. The beetles would be given a plot of land outside the cultivated fields where they could live peacefully. If they stayed on their designated land, they would be left alone. If they returned to the crops, they would be formally excommunicated and cursed. Again, this solution assumed beetles could understand property boundaries and legal agreements. Spoiler alert, they couldn't. But here's the thing that's easy to miss. These animal trials and excommunications weren't just about superstition. They were about community psychology and social control. When crops failed or animals attacked people, medieval communities needed someone or something to blame. They needed to feel like they were doing something about the problem. Putting animals on trial and excommunicating pests gave people a sense of control in a world where they had very little. It provided a structured, ritualized way to respond to disasters. It reinforced social order and religious authority. And honestly, it probably made people feel better. If your crops were destroyed by locusts, at least you could curse those locusts with the power of the church. It might not save your harvest, but it gave you something to do besides starve in despair. Chapter 3. Animals as Witnesses and Oaths. Medieval people didn't just put animals on trial. They sometimes used animals as witnesses in legal proceedings. Now, before you picture a horse taking the stand and testifying under oath, let me clarify. Animals couldn't literally testify, but their behavior was sometimes used as evidence in trials. Trial by ordeal was a common medieval practice where God was supposed to reveal the truth through supernatural intervention. and animals played a role in some of these ordeals. In some regions, if you were accused of a crime and wanted to prove your innocence, you might have to hold a hot iron, walk over burning coals, or fight a duel. But there was also the option of swearing an oath on holy relics while holding certain animals. The logic was that God would strike you dead, or at least make something bad happen, if you swore a false oath while touching a sacred object. And some animals were considered sacred or holy enough to serve this purpose. Swans, for example, were associated with royalty and purity. In some cases, accused criminals would have to swear their innocence while touching a swan. If the swan remained calm, it was a good sign. If the swan freaked out and attacked, well, clearly God was revealing your guilt through his feathered representative. Dogs were sometimes used in similar ways. In some medieval communities, if you were accused of theft, you might have to swear your innocence in the presence of dogs that had been blessed by a priest. The belief was that holy dogs could sense evil and would bark at or attack a liar. This is essentially medieval lie detector testing, except instead of measuring your heart rate, they watched to see if blessed dogs wanted to bite you. Cats, on the other hand, were more complicated. Medieval people had a deeply ambivalent relationship with cats. On one hand, cats were useful for controlling rodent populations. On the other hand, cats were associated with witchcraft, the devil, and pagan goddesses. A cat's behavior could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural activity. If a cat acted strangely around you, people might suspect you were a witch or in league with demons. There are records of accused witches being tested by seeing how cats reacted to them. If cats seemed attracted to the accused person, it might be evidence of a demonic familiar. If cats ran away from the accused, it might mean the person had holy power that repelled demonic creatures. Basically, no matter what the cat did, it could be interpreted as evidence for whatever people already wanted to believe. Birds were also used as omens in legal contexts. The behavior of birds, especially ravens and crows, was believed to reveal divine judgment. If birds circled overhead during a trial, it might be interpreted as a sign of guilt. If birds flew away, it might mean innocence. This wasn't formal legal evidence, but it could influence judges and juries who believed in divine signs. Medieval people also swore oaths on animals in business transactions. If you were making a deal, you might swear on the life of your horse or your ox that you would keep your word. If you broke the oath, the animal could be seized as compensation. This wasn't symbolic. Animals were valuable property, and swearing on them was like putting up collateral. Your livestock was literally on the line. Some oaths went even further. In medieval Iceland, there are records of legal disputes being settled by animal combat. If two parties couldn't agree on who owned a piece of land or who was right in a dispute, they might agree to let their animals fight it out. Usually, this involved bulls, or rams. The owner of the winning animal won the legal dispute. This was basically trial by combat, except you outsourced the actual fighting to your livestock. The most bizarre use of animals in legal proceedings might be the practice of corsned, or trial by blessed bread. This was an Anglo-Saxon practice that continued in some parts of England into the medieval period. If you were accused of a crime, you had to eat a piece of bread or cheese that had been blessed by a priest. The bread was usually quite large and dry. The belief was that if you were guilty, God would make you choke on the bread. If you were innocent, you could swallow it easily. But here's where animals come in. Sometimes the bread was mixed with feathers or fur. The idea was that the rough texture would make it even harder to swallow, increasing the supernatural test's effectiveness. So accused criminals were sometimes forced to eat bread mixed with animal parts while priests prayed for God to reveal the truth. If you managed to choke it down, you were innocent. If you couldn't swallow it, or if you vomited, you were guilty. From a modern perspective, this is just a test of how good you are at swallowing dry bread while extremely anxious, which seems like a terrible way to determine guilt. But medieval people saw it as divine judgment channeled through physical ordeal, and somehow animal parts made it more legitimate. Part 2. Animals in Medieval Medicine. Chapter 1: When your doctor prescribed a zoo. Medieval medicine was a fascinating combination of ancient wisdom, religious belief, superstition, and stuff that people just made up and hoped would work, and animals played an absolutely massive role in medical treatment. I'm not just talking about using animal products like we might use lanolin in lotion today. I'm talking about treatments that involved live animals, fresh animal organs, and practices that would make modern doctors run screaming from the room. Let's start with one of the most common medieval medical practices, using live animals as treatment. If you had a fever, your doctor might prescribe wrapping yourself in the freshly skinned hide of a sheep or cow. The logic was that the animal's warmth would draw out the evil humors causing your fever. Never mind that covering a feverish person in a heavy, warm animal hide would probably make the fever worse. Medieval doctors were really big on the concept of like treats like, which led to some truly bizarre treatments. Got a headache? Your medieval physician might recommend strapping a live pigeon to your head. The heat from the living bird was supposed to draw out the pain. Some texts specify that the pigeon should be split in half while still alive and then pressed against the patient's head, which is both horrifying and completely ineffective. But hey, at least you'd be too distracted by the dead bird on your head to think about your headache. Suffering from epilepsy? Medieval doctors had a solution. Drink a mixture containing powdered human skull and blood from a freshly killed animal, preferably a dove or a hare. The logic here was that the vital force from the animal's blood would strengthen your body's vital force, preventing seizures. This is essentially medieval energy drink theory, except instead of taurine and caffeine, you're drinking blood and bone dust. Plague was obviously a major concern in medieval Europe, especially after the Black Death killed a third of the population in the 14th century. And medieval doctors came up with some creative animal-based treatments. One popular remedy was to place a live chicken's rear end against the plague buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that characterize the disease. The theory was that the chicken would draw out the poison from the buboes. In practice, this meant you had a terrified chicken pressed against your swollen, painful lymph nodes while you were dying of plague. The chicken would usually die too, which was taken as evidence that it had successfully absorbed the poison. In reality, the chicken probably died from the stress of being manhandled by plague victims. Another plague treatment involved creating a powder from dried toads. Toads were associated with poison in medieval thought. So by the logic of like treats like, toad powder should cure poisoning from plague. Doctors would collect toads, dry them out, grind them into powder, and then have plague victims consume it. Sometimes they'd mix the toad powder with other ingredients, like herbs and wine, to make it more palatable. Did it work? No. Did people keep doing it anyway? Absolutely. Respiratory problems were treated with animal fats and oils. If you had a cough, your doctor might prescribe goose fat rubbed on your chest. Asthma might be treated with badger grease. Tuberculosis, which medieval people called consumption, was sometimes treated by having the patient sleep with sheep or goats. The idea was that the animal's breath and body heat would transfer their vital force to the sick person, curing the disease. This probably just resulted in a lot of uncomfortable nights, sleeping with livestock, and possibly contracting additional diseases from animal contact. Eye problems were treated with some particularly nasty animal-based remedies. Cataracts might be treated with a mixture of bile from various animals, particularly eagles, which were thought to have superior vision. Never mind that eagle bile probably contains absolutely nothing that would help cataracts. But hey, eagles have good eyesight, so surely their bile must contain the essence of good vision, right? Medieval logic was something else. Snake bites and spider bites were treated with blood from the same type of animal that bit you. Got bit by a snake? Your doctor would find a similar snake, kill it, and apply its blood to your wound. This is like treats like, taken to its extreme. The theory was that the venom of one snake could be neutralized by the blood of another snake. Sometimes this might have had a placebo effect. Mostly, it was just messy and didn't work. Medieval medicine also made extensive use of animal dung. Yes, really. Cow dung was used to treat wounds and ulcers. Chicken droppings were used for baldness. Dove dung was used for eye problems. The justification varied, but it often came down to the belief that animal waste contained powerful essences that could affect human bodies. In reality, applying feces to wounds is a great way to get a serious infection, which medieval people didn't understand because they didn't know about germ theory. Urine was another popular animal-based medicine. Horse urine was used to treat dropsy, edema. Dog urine was believed to help with skin conditions. Some medieval texts recommend washing wounds with urine because it was thought to have cleansing properties. Urine does have some antiseptic qualities due to its acidity, so this might have occasionally worked, but it definitely wasn't the best option available even by medieval standards. Animal blood was used in transfusion-like procedures long before actual blood transfusions were invented. If you were weak or anemic, a doctor might recommend drinking fresh blood from a healthy animal. Pig blood was particularly popular because pigs were readily available. Sometimes the blood would be mixed with wine or herbs to make it more palatable. Did this work? Well, drinking blood does provide some nutrients, particularly iron, so it might have helped with anemia in the same way eating liver would, but it also carried risks of disease transmission and digestive problems. One of the most elaborate animal-based treatments was theriac, a complex mixture that supposedly cured everything. The recipe varied, but it usually included dozens of ingredients, many of them animal-based. Viper flesh was a key component. The snakes would be killed, cleaned, boiled, and then mixed with herbs, spices, and other ingredients. The resulting paste was aged like wine, sometimes for years, before being used as medicine. Theriac was considered a cure-all, effective against poison, plague, snake bites, stomach problems, and pretty much any ailment you could name. It was extremely expensive because of the complex recipe and long preparation time. Kings and nobles kept supplies of theriac on hand as protection against poisoning. Did it work? Probably not as a cure-all, though the various herbs in it might have had some medicinal properties. But the viper flesh definitely didn't add any therapeutic value. Chapter 2: Animal Parts and Potions. If using live animals in medicine wasn't weird enough, medieval people also used virtually every part of dead animals in their medicines. And I mean every part. Medieval medical texts read like catalogs of animal parts and what ailments they supposedly cured. Bones were ground into powder and used for everything from broken bones, like treats like, again, to sexual dysfunction. Antlers from deer were particularly prized. Powdered deer antler was believed to be an aphrodisiac and a general health tonic. This belief was so widespread that deer populations in some regions were seriously depleted from overhunting for their antlers. Horns from various animals were used similarly. Rhinoceros horn was especially valued, imported at great expense from Africa and Asia. It was believed to cure everything from fever to demonic possession. The rarity and expense of rhino horn made it a status symbol. Only the wealthy could afford it. Unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, was the ultimate status symbol medicine. A single genuine unicorn horn could be worth more than a castle. It was believed to neutralize all poisons and cure all diseases. Teeth and claws were used as protective amulets and ground into medicines. Wolf teeth were thought to prevent fear and give courage. Bear claws were used to cure gout. Eagle talons were worn as protection against evil. The logic was sympathetic magic. If you consumed or wore part of a powerful animal, you gained some of its power. Internal organs were used for all sorts of treatments. Liver was eaten to cure liver problems. Heart was consumed to treat heart conditions. Lungs were prescribed for respiratory issues. This actually has some logic to it. Organs do contain nutrients and compounds that might be beneficial. Eating liver provides vitamin A and iron. But medieval people took it further, believing that eating an animal's organ would directly strengthen the corresponding human organ through mystical correspondence. The spleen was particularly interesting in medieval medicine. The spleen was associated with black bile, one of the four humors that supposedly controlled health and temperament. An excess of black bile caused melancholy, what we'd call depression today. So medieval doctors would prescribe medicines made from animal spleens to balance the humors and cure sadness. Did it work? No more than placebo, but the belief persisted for centuries. Brains were used to treat mental illnesses and headaches. If you were considered insane, you might be given medicine containing animal brains. The type of animal mattered. Predator brains were thought to make you fierce and brave, while prey animal brains would make you timid and gentle. So treating aggression might involve medicines made from rabbit brains, while treating cowardice might require wolf brains. This is sympathetic magic taken to its logical or illogical extreme. Fat and marrow were considered particularly potent medicines. Bear fat was prized as a cure-all, used for everything from arthritis to baldness. It was rubbed on joints, wounds, and scalps. Bone marrow was eaten as a strengthening food and used in medicines for weakness and wasting diseases. Again, these animal products do contain nutrients, so they might have had some beneficial effects, but nowhere near what medieval people believed. Blood was everywhere in medieval medicine, both literally and figuratively. The theory of the four humors meant that balance was key, and bloodletting was used to remove excess blood. But animal blood was also used in medicines. Fresh blood from various animals was prescribed for anemia, weakness, and various diseases. Blood was also used in more symbolic ways. Mixing your blood with animal blood in rituals was believed to create mystical connections. Milk and dairy products from animals were used medicinally. Donkey milk was considered especially beneficial for skin conditions and was used by wealthy women as a beauty treatment. Cleopatra's supposed baths in donkey milk became a medieval ideal. Goat milk was prescribed for stomach problems and weakness. Breast milk from nursing animals was sometimes used to treat eye conditions. Drops of milk directly in the eye, which sounds both uncomfortable and likely to cause infection. Animal fat was rendered into oils and unguents. These were used as bases for other medicines and as treatments themselves. Goose fat, pig fat, and mutton fat were commonly used. They were rubbed on chests for respiratory problems, on joints for arthritis, and on wounds as protective coverings. These might have had some benefit as moisturizers and wound barriers, but medieval people attributed much more powerful effects to them. Gallstones from various animals were highly prized. Bezoars, which are solid masses of indigestible material found in animal stomachs, were considered powerful antidotes to poison. If you were wealthy enough to own a bezoar, you might dip it in your wine before drinking as protection against poisoning. This practice was common enough among the nobility that elaborate bezoar holders were created, often made of gold and jewels. Even excrement continued to make appearances beyond topical applications. Dried and powdered animal dung was consumed as medicine for various ailments. Bat guano was particularly valued in some regions, imported at great expense. The logic was often that animals ate specific plants, and their processed waste contained concentrated essences of those plants. This is technically true in a very limited sense, but not in any way that would make feces an effective medicine. Insects were not left out of the medical catalog. Crushed beetles were used for urinary problems. Ants were prepared various ways for skin conditions. Bees and their products, honey, wax, propolis, and even the bees themselves were used extensively. Honey was actually one of the few medieval medicines that genuinely works. It has antibacterial properties and is good for wound treatment and soothing sore throats. Medieval people didn't understand why it worked, but they correctly observed that it did. Spiders were used in creative ways. Spider webs were applied to wounds to stop bleeding, which actually has some scientific basis. Spider silk has hemostatic properties, but medieval people also used live spiders in medicines. Swallowing a live spider wrapped in butter or bread was prescribed for various illnesses. The spider would supposedly eat the disease from inside you. This is horrifying and doesn't work, but it was a genuine medical recommendation in multiple medieval texts. Leeches deserve their own mention because bloodletting was such a central practice in medieval medicine. Leeches were applied to remove bad blood and balance the humors. Medieval doctors had elaborate theories about where to apply leeches for different conditions. Too much blood in the head causing headaches, leeches on the temples, digestive problems, leeches on the abdomen. This practice actually continued well into the 19th century. The strangest animal-derived medicines might be the ones involving animal secretions. Ambergris, a waxy substance produced in sperm whale intestines and found floating in the ocean, was worth more than gold. It was used in medicines and perfumes. Musk from deer glands was similarly valuable. Castoreum from beaver anal glands was used for various purposes, including medicine. All of these were rare, expensive, and believed to have powerful properties. Some actually did have medicinal effects due to their complex chemical compositions, though not the magical properties attributed to them. Medieval people also believed in using whole animals in preparations. Small animals might be drowned in wine or oil to create medicinal tinctures. Mice, lizards, and frogs were all prepared this way. The resulting liquid was filtered and used as medicine. The theory was that the animal's life force would be preserved in the liquid. This is essentially medieval attempts at extracting active compounds, but done in ways that would make a modern chemist weep. Far as what people did with animals in the Middle Ages. Part 2-3. Part 3. Animals in religion and superstition. Chapter 1. When animals were saints and demons. Medieval Christianity had a complicated relationship with animals. On one hand, animals were part of God's creation and therefore good. On the other hand, animals lacked souls and couldn't be saved, which made them fundamentally lesser than humans. But then again, animals appeared throughout the Bible, and many saints had famous interactions with animals. The result was a religious worldview where animals could be anything from holy messengers to demonic servants, sometimes within the same theological framework. Let's start with the saints and their animals. Medieval people loved stories about saints performing miracles involving animals, and these stories were wildly popular. Saint Francis of Assisi is probably the most famous for his connection to animals. According to legend, Francis preached to birds who listened attentively to his sermons. He allegedly negotiated a peace treaty between a town and a wolf that had been terrorizing the citizens. The wolf agreed to stop eating people, and in exchange, the townspeople would feed it. And supposedly, the wolf kept its promise. Now, modern historians are skeptical about whether these events literally happened, but medieval people believed them completely. Churches displayed relics associated with these animal miracles. The supposed remains of St. Francis's wolf became pilgrimage destinations. People prayed to St. Francis when they had problems with animals. He became the patron saint of animals, a role he still holds today. But Francis wasn't alone. St. Jerome was famous for removing a thorn from a lion's paw, after which the grateful lion became his companion and protector. Medieval art is full of images of Jerome with his lion. St. Anthony the Abbot was associated with pigs and became their patron saint. Paintings and sculptures show Anthony with a pig at his feet. Why pigs? Because the monks of his order raised pigs, and the pigs were allowed to wander freely through towns, marked with bells to identify them as St. Anthony's pigs. These holy pigs had special privileges. They could go anywhere and eat anything, and citizens were expected to tolerate them because they belonged to the saint. This led to a lot of tension because pigs are destructive animals. Your garden might get destroyed by St. Anthony's pigs, and you were supposed to just accept it as a holy inconvenience. Of course, this also meant that some regular pig owners tried to pass their pigs off as holy pigs by putting bells on them, leading to medieval pig fraud. Saint Brigid of Ireland was said to have a cow that produced abundant milk, enough to supply an entire monastery. When someone stole her cow, Brigid prayed, and the thief's cattle all went dry, while Brigid's cow continued producing. The thief returned the cow and converted to Christianity. Stories like this reinforce the idea that God rewarded the faithful and punished those who wronged his saints, even in matters involving livestock. Medieval people believed that animals could be vessels for divine messages. If an animal behaved unusually, it might be God trying to tell you something. A cow refusing to be milked might be protesting its owner's sins. A horse stumbling might be warning its rider of danger ahead. Birds gathering in unusual numbers could signal impending disaster or divine intervention. But here's where it gets dark. If animals could carry divine messages, they could also carry demonic ones. Medieval theology held that demons could possess or control animals to do their bidding. Black cats became associated with witchcraft and the devil. Toads were considered demonic creatures. Ravens and crows, because they ate carrion, were seen as agents of death and possibly demons. The devil himself was often depicted with animal features: horns, hooves, a tail, bat wings. This wasn't just artistic license. Medieval people believed the devil could take animal form to tempt or terrorize humans. Stories of people encountering demonic animals were common. A traveler might meet a black dog that spoke in a human voice, revealing itself to be a demon. A woman might be visited by a cat that urged her to renounce Christ and worship Satan. Witch trials often involved accusations that the accused witch had a familiar, an animal companion that was actually a demon in disguise. These familiars supposedly helped witches cast spells and perform malevolent magic. Cats were the most common familiars, but dogs, toads, rats, and even insects could be accused of being demons. During witch trials, prosecutors would look for evidence of familiars. If an accused witch had any pet, or if animals seemed comfortable around her, it could be used as evidence of witchcraft. This led to mass killings of cats during various periods of medieval and early modern history. Cats were seen as agents of Satan, so killing them was considered righteous. Pope Gregory IX issued a papal bull in 1233 that associated cats with devil worship. This contributed to the persecution of cats throughout Europe. Ironically, killing cats probably made the Black Death worse in the 14th century because there were fewer cats to control rat populations, and rats carried the plague-bearing fleas. Medieval churches had complex rituals involving animals. The blessing of animals was a common practice. On certain feast days, people would bring their livestock, pets, and work animals to church to be blessed by the priest. This was believed to protect the animals from disease, improve their productivity, and ensure they served their owners well. The priest would sprinkle holy water on the animals and recite prayers asking God to watch over them. Some churches had dedicated animal blessing ceremonies that were elaborate affairs. In Spain, the feast of St. Anthony the Abbot involved bringing all the village's animals to the church for blessing. Horses, donkeys, pigs, chickens, dogs, everything got blessed. The animals were often decorated with flowers and ribbons for the occasion. After the blessing, there would be a procession through town with all the blessed animals, followed by celebrations. But animals weren't just passive recipients of blessings. They played active roles in religious ceremonies. Donkeys were used in Palm Sunday celebrations, reenacting Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. A priest would ride a donkey through the streets while the congregation waved palm branches. In some regions, the donkey would be brought inside the church for part of the ceremony, which must have been interesting given that donkeys don't always behave appropriately in sacred spaces. The Feast of the Ass was one of the strangest medieval religious celebrations. Celebrated in some French cathedrals during the Middle Ages, this feast commemorated Mary's flight to Egypt with baby Jesus on a donkey. During the ceremony, a young woman holding a baby would ride a donkey into the cathedral and up to the altar. The entire Mass would be conducted with the donkey present. At certain points, the congregation would bray like donkeys instead of saying, "Amen." Yes, really. Medieval Christians barked like donkeys in church as part of a religious ceremony. The church eventually banned this practice because it was getting out of hand, but it persisted in some areas for centuries. It's a perfect example of how medieval religious practice could be both deeply serious and completely bizarre by modern standards. Animals also played roles in religious drama and mystery plays. These were theatrical productions that depicted Bible stories and saints' lives. Real animals were used when possible. If the play involved Noah's Ark, they'd bring in pairs of animals. If the play involved Daniel in the lion's den, they'd try to get actual lions, though more often they'd use dogs dressed up as lions. These performances were hugely popular and drew massive crowds. The animals, of course, didn't always cooperate. Medieval records include accounts of animals escaping during performances, attacking actors, or just refusing to do what they were supposed to do. Imagine trying to perform the story of Jonah and the whale with an actual whale. It didn't happen, but medieval theater producers tried some ambitious things with animal actors. Chapter 2: Superstitions and Omens. Medieval superstitions involving animals were endless and often contradictory. The same animal could be considered lucky or unlucky depending on the circumstances, the region, or who you asked. But these beliefs were taken seriously and affected daily life in significant ways. Birds were perhaps the most important omen animals. Their flight patterns, songs, and behaviors were closely observed and interpreted. A raven cawing on your roof meant death was coming to your household. A robin entering your house was good luck. A sparrow flying into a church during Mass was a sign of divine favor, or impending doom, depending on which priest you asked. Magpies had an entire rhyme system for interpreting their numbers: 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy. You know the rhyme. Medieval people took this seriously. Seeing a single magpie was such bad luck that people would greet the magpie respectfully and ask about its wife and children, hoping to appease it and avoid the sorrow it prophesied. Owls were almost universally considered bad omens. An owl hooting near your house meant someone would die soon. Owls were associated with witches and evil spirits. If an owl landed on your roof, you should immediately make the sign of the cross and say prayers of protection. Some people would kill owls on sight, nail them to barn doors as warnings to other owls, or burn them to ward off evil. But here's the contradiction. Owl eggs were considered valuable for medicine and magic, so people simultaneously feared and hunted owls. Medieval logic meant you could believe owls were evil omens, while also believing their body parts could cure you or bring you luck. Roosters crowing at unusual times was significant. A rooster crowing at midnight meant demons were near. A rooster crowing while facing your door meant visitors were coming. 3 crows from a rooster meant different things, depending on which direction it was facing. Medieval people paid close attention to their roosters. Remember that rooster we talked about earlier that was executed for laying an egg? That wasn't just about the legal system. Medieval people genuinely believed that a rooster laying an egg was a demonic act that could produce a cockatrice or basilisk, a monster that could kill with its gaze. This belief was so strong that roosters were sometimes killed preemptively if they showed any unusual behavior. Hens cackling at night was also a bad omen. It suggested witches were near, or that evil spirits were disturbing the animals. If your chicken started acting weird, you might sprinkle holy water in the coop, say protective prayers, or check for signs of witchcraft. Cats, as we've mentioned, were deeply unlucky in medieval Europe, especially black cats. A black cat crossing your path meant disaster. A black cat entering your home meant death. But in some regions, cats of other colors were considered good luck. A white cat, for instance, might bring prosperity. This regional variation meant that a cat that was lucky in one village might be killed as a demon in the next village over. Dogs howling for no apparent reason was a death omen. If a dog howled continuously while looking at a specific house, someone in that house would die soon. If a dog refused to enter a building, it meant the building was haunted or cursed. Dogs were thought to be able to see ghosts and spirits that humans couldn't perceive, but dogs were also protective. A dog's presence could ward off evil spirits. Dogs were buried under doorsteps to protect homes from witchcraft. Dog collars were sometimes blessed by priests and kept as protective. Amulets, so dogs were simultaneously death omens and protective spirits. Horses had their own set of superstitions. A horse seeing something invisible and refusing to go forward meant a ghost or demon was blocking the path. If your horse suddenly became terrified, for no apparent reason, you should immediately turn back because danger lay ahead. Horses sweating in cold weather meant evil spirits were tormenting them. Finding a horseshoe was lucky, but it had to be positioned correctly. The horseshoe had to be hung with the ends pointing up, like a U, to catch the luck. Hanging it upside down would let the luck drain out. This superstition is still around today, showing how persistent some medieval beliefs are. Cows and livestock had numerous superstitions attached. A cow mooing in the night meant death. A cow giving birth to twins was lucky. A cow giving birth to a deformed calf was a sign of witchcraft and curses. The first milk from a cow after giving birth had magical properties and couldn't be sold or given away, or the cow would go dry. If your livestock suddenly sickened or died, the first explanation medieval people reached for was witchcraft. Someone had cursed your animals. The solution was to find the witch and force them to remove the curse, or to perform counter magic to protect the remaining animals. This often involved hanging protective amulets in the barn, burying objects under the stable floor, or having a priest bless the animals. Pigs rooting near your door meant financial troubles. Pigs squealing more than usual meant a storm was coming. Pigs eating their young was such a bad omen that the sow would often be killed. The belief was that an animal engaging in such unnatural behavior had been possessed by demons. Sheep were generally positive omens, probably because of their association with Christ as the Lamb of God. But even sheep had dark superstitions. A black lamb in a white flock was unlucky, sheep lying down in the middle of the day meant rain was coming. Sheep refusing to enter a field meant the field was cursed. Rabbits were complicated. Rabbits were associated with witches because they came out at dawn and dusk, liminal times when the veil between worlds was thin. A rabbit crossing your path could be a witch in disguise, but rabbits' feet were lucky charms. You had to kill the rabbit in a specific way, at a specific time, to get a lucky rabbit's foot. The left hind foot was luckiest, especially if the rabbit was killed in a cemetery under a full moon. Medieval lucky charms required a lot of very specific conditions. Toads were almost universally considered evil. Toads were associated with witchcraft, poison, and the devil. Finding a toad in your house meant a witch had sent it to curse you. The correct response was to kill it immediately and burn it, then sprinkle salt and holy water where it had been. Toadstones, actually fossilized teeth of prehistoric fish that looked like toads, were worn as protection against poison and witchcraft. Snakes were demonic because of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Seeing a snake was bad luck. Killing a snake was good. Some regions had annual snake-killing festivals, where men would go out and kill as many snakes as possible to reduce evil in the world. However, snake skin was valuable for magic and medicine, so dead snakes had commercial value. Bats were terrifying to medieval people. Bats flew at night, looked demonic, and sometimes sucked blood. Vampire bats, though medieval Europeans mostly encountered insectivorous bats. A bat flying into your house was one of the worst omens possible. It meant death, demons, or witches. The bat had to be killed immediately and burned. But again, dead bats were valuable for magical purposes, so there was a market for them. Spiders were ambiguous. If you wished to live and thrive, let the spider run alive, was a common saying. Killing a spider brought bad luck, but spiders were also associated with the devil and with lying. Spider webs were considered both protective, they could catch evil, and dangerous, they could trap your soul. Medieval people had complicated feelings about spiders. Insects in general were seen as evidence of divine displeasure. A plague of locusts or caterpillars meant God was angry with your community. The solution was prayer, fasting, and those animal excommunications we talked about earlier. But some insects were considered holy. Bees were particularly special. Chapter 3. The special case of bees deserved their own section because medieval people had an absolutely fascinating relationship with them. Bees were considered miraculous creatures. They produced honey, which was the primary sweetener in medieval Europe before sugar became available. They produced wax for candles, especially the pure beeswax candles used in churches, and they seemed to live in perfect ordered societies that medieval people admired. Medieval people believed bees were virginal and pure. They thought bees reproduced without sex, making them symbols of chastity and the Virgin Mary. This wasn't true. Medieval people didn't understand how bee reproduction actually worked, but they believed it fervently. Churches kept beehives to produce wax for holy candles, and the bees themselves were considered blessed creatures. Because bees were so special, you had to treat them with respect. There was an entire code of conduct for interacting with your beehives. You had to tell the bees about major family events. When someone died, you had to go to the hives and inform the bees. The master is dead, you would tell them, draping the hives in black cloth. If you didn't tell the bees, they would leave or die. This practice, called telling the bees, persisted well into the 20th century in rural areas. You also had to tell the bees about births, marriages, and other significant events. The bees needed to know what was happening in the family because they were part of the household. Some families gave their bees pieces of wedding cake after a wedding. Others would sing to the bees or recite prayers to them. Bees were believed to respond to sin. If you approached a beehive with sin on your soul, the bees would know and would sting you. Adulterers and thieves couldn't work with bees. The bees would either attack them or leave the hive. This made beekeepers sort of morally superior by default. If you could work with bees successfully, it meant you were virtuous. Swarms had special significance. When a swarm of bees left a hive, it was a momentous occasion. The swarm had to be followed and captured, or it would be bad luck. There were elaborate rituals for capturing swarms, involving banging on pots and pans to make the bees land. Once the swarm landed, you could claim it as your own, but you had to do so properly. Some regions required you to inform the bees that they now had a new home and a new keeper. A swarm landing on your property uninvited was incredibly lucky. It was a gift from God. You had to welcome the bees properly and provide them with a good hive. The honey they produced would be especially blessed. Some people believed that bees would only swarm to the homes of good people. So having bees choose your property was a sign of divine favor. Bees humming was considered a form of prayer. Medieval texts describe bees as singing hymns while they work. Some monasteries kept beehives near the chapel, so the monks could hear the bees' prayers while they prayed. The sound of bees was considered soothing and holy. Killing bees unnecessarily was a sin. If you had to harvest honey, you were supposed to do it carefully and thank the bees for their work. Some beekeepers would apologize to the bees before taking their honey, explaining that they needed it but appreciated the bees' labor. This wasn't just politeness. People genuinely believed the bees understood and would respond accordingly. Beeswax candles made from church hives were considered especially holy. The wax from virginal bees who sang hymns while they worked, that was the most pure and blessed substance imaginable for making candles. These candles were used in the most important religious ceremonies. Regular tallow candles were for everyday use, but beeswax candles were for communicating with God. Medieval medicine used honey extensively, as we discussed earlier, but also used the bees themselves. Dead bees could be ground up and used in medicines. Royal jelly, the substance bees feed to future queens, was considered a miracle cure for everything. Bee stings were actually used medicinally too. The venom was thought to have healing properties for arthritis and other conditions. This isn't entirely wrong. Bee venom does have anti-inflammatory properties, but medieval people had no idea why it worked. Mead, the honey wine, was considered a noble drink. It was associated with gods and heroes in ancient traditions, and medieval people continued to revere it. Mead made from honey from church beehives was especially valued. Some monasteries produced mead as their primary product, using the honey from their blessed bees. There were laws protecting bees. Stealing bees or honey was a serious crime in many medieval legal codes. The punishment could be severe, sometimes including mutilation or death, depending on the region and the value of what was stolen. This wasn't just about property, it was about stealing blessed creatures and their holy products. Part 4. Animals as food and fasting. Chapter 1. What counted as meat. Medieval eating habits were heavily influenced by the Catholic Church's fasting rules, and this created some truly bizarre classifications of animals. The Church decreed that Christians should fast on certain days. No meat was allowed. In practice, this meant about half the days of the year were fast days. But what counted as meat? The basic rule was that warm-blooded animals that lived on land were meat. Cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, obviously meat. Can't eat them on fast days. But here's where it gets interesting. Cold-blooded animals and anything that lived primarily in water wasn't considered meat. Fish were fine, but medieval people stretched this definition to absurd lengths. Beavers were classified as fish. Yes, really. The logic was that beavers spent most of their time in water and had scaly tails. They don't, but medieval people thought they did. Therefore, beavers were fish. Therefore, you could eat beaver on fast days. The Church officially approved this classification. Monks ate beaver regularly during Lent. Barnacle geese were also classified as fish. There was a medieval belief that barnacle geese hatched from barnacles that grew on driftwood in the ocean. Since they came from the sea, they were obviously fish, not birds. Never mind that people could clearly observe barnacle geese, mating, nesting, and raising chicks, like normal birds. The barnacle origin story was more convenient for eating purposes, so it persisted. Irish and Scottish monasteries ate barnacle goose during Lent, and the Church allowed it. Puffins were classified as fish in some regions because they lived on ocean cliffs and ate fish. Capybaras in South America were declared fish by the Church because they lived in water. The pattern here is obvious. If you wanted to eat something on a fast day, you argued it was somehow related to water or fish. And if the argument was even remotely plausible, the Church might allow it. Some monks got really creative. There are records of monastic communities arguing that certain birds were actually fish because they ate fish, or because they lived near water, or because their meat was kind of fishy tasting. The Church had to issue clarifications repeatedly because monks kept trying to expand the definition of fish. Eggs were complicated. Chicken eggs were clearly from a land animal, so they should be forbidden on fast days. But eggs were so useful for cooking and nutrition that many communities argued they should be allowed. The result was regional variation. Some areas banned eggs on fast days, others allowed them. Some allowed eggs from water birds, but not land birds. It was a mess. Dairy was similarly contested. Milk, cheese, and butter came from land animals, so technically they should be forbidden on fast days. But dairy was such a staple of medieval diets that banning it created serious nutritional problems. Different regions handled this differently. Some banned all dairy on fast days. Others allowed it. Some required you to pay a fee to the Church to get permission to eat dairy during Lent. This led to the creation of butter towers in some regions. Wealthy Christians who wanted to eat butter during Lent could pay a substantial fee to the Church. The money was used to build church towers, which became known as butter towers because they were essentially built with butter-gilt money. The Cathedral of Rouen in France has a famous butter tower built this way. The rich, as always, found ways around restrictions that the poor couldn't afford. If you were wealthy, you could get dispensations to eat meat on fast days for health reasons. You could pay for special permission. You could argue that you needed meat to maintain your strength for important duties. Monasteries that housed nobility often had separate kitchens where meat was prepared for their noble guests, even on fast days. The poor had no such options. They followed the rules strictly because they couldn't afford not to. Getting caught eating meat on a fast day could result in public penance, fines, or punishment. The Church took fasting seriously. and violations were considered sins that required confession and atonement. This created a two-tier system where the wealthy ate well, even on fast days. Lots of fancy fish dishes, expensive imports, creative classifications, while the poor ate bread and vegetables. Fast days were supposed to be about spiritual discipline and equality before God, but they often just highlighted economic inequality. Chapter 2. Exotic Animals and Status. Wealthy medieval people loved exotic animals. Owning a lion or a leopard or an elephant was the ultimate status symbol. Kings and nobles imported animals from Africa and Asia at enormous expense, not because the animals were useful, but because they demonstrated wealth and power. Royal menageries were common at medieval courts. The Tower of London had a famous menagerie that included lions, leopards, bears, and an elephant. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II kept a traveling menagerie that accompanied him wherever he went, including a giraffe that apparently caused a sensation everywhere it appeared. People had never seen anything like these creatures. These animals were displayed to visitors and foreign dignitaries as demonstrations of the ruler's magnificence. Look at, my lion was essentially a medieval equivalent of, look at my yacht. It showed that you had the resources to import exotic animals, house them, feed them, and keep them alive in climates they weren't adapted to. It was conspicuous consumption taken to an extreme. Some nobles gave exotic animals as diplomatic gifts. Sending someone a leopard or a lion was a way of saying, I'm so wealthy and powerful that I can casually give away incredibly expensive animals. The recipients then had to figure out what to do with their new lions, which was probably more stressful than impressive. Exotic animals also appeared in royal ceremonies and celebrations. Lions and leopards were paraded through streets during coronations and weddings. Bears performed at feasts. Monkeys entertained guests at banquets. These weren't modern trained circus animals. They were wild animals with minimal training, which made the performances dangerous and unpredictable. People were occasionally mauled at these events, which probably added to the excitement for spectators. Hunting exotic animals was the ultimate sport. Wealthy nobles organized elaborate hunts for imported animals. They'd release lions or leopards in enclosed parks, and then hunt them with hounds and spears. This was considered the pinnacle of knightly valor, fighting dangerous foreign beasts. Never mind that the animals were confused, frightened, and often half-starved to make them less dangerous. It was all about the prestige of saying you'd killed a lion. Some exotic animals were believed to have magical properties. Unicorn horns, as mentioned earlier, were actually narwhal tusks and were worth fortunes, but people also believed that rhinoceros horns, elephant ivory, and various other exotic animal parts had magical or medicinal properties. This created a thriving trade in exotic animal parts, many of which were fraudulent. Merchants would sell regular horns or bones as exotic treasures to gullible nobles. Elephants were particularly fascinating to medieval Europeans because they were so unlike any animal they knew. Medieval bestiaries described elephants as having no knees, they do, being unable to lie down, they can, and being terrified of mice. This one actually seems to be somewhat true. When real elephants appeared in Europe, crowds would gather to see them, often paying admission fees. The most famous medieval elephant was probably Abul Abbas, an elephant given to Charlemagne by the Abbasid Caliph in 797. This elephant lived for several years in Charlemagne's court and became legendary. When it died, people talked about it for generations. Medieval chroniclers described it in detail, often exaggerating its size and intelligence to legendary proportions. Monkeys and apes were popular exotic pets among the nobility. They were smaller and easier to keep than lions, but still exotic enough to impress people. Medieval art often shows nobles with pet monkeys. These monkeys were dressed in human clothes, taught tricks, and generally treated as amusing curiosities. The welfare of the animals was not a concern. Some exotic animals were used in warfare or attempted to be used. War elephants were known from classical history. and some medieval rulers tried to recreate them. Frederick II brought elephants on military campaigns. They weren't very effective. Elephants aren't adapted to European climates and terrain, but they certainly intimidated enemies who had never seen them before. Birds of prey were both practical hunting tools and status symbols. Falconry was a noble sport, and the type of bird you could own was determined by your social rank. Emperors and kings flew eagles, nobles flew falcons and hawks. Lower-ranking people could fly smaller birds like kestrels. Flying a bird above your rank was actually illegal in some regions. Your hunting bird was a visible marker of your social status. The training of hunting birds was serious business. Falconers were specialized professionals who commanded high salaries. Training a bird could take months or years. A well-trained hunting falcon was worth more than a horse. These birds were so valuable that there were laws protecting them. Stealing a falcon could result in execution in some medieval legal codes. Peacocks were imported from Asia and kept by wealthy estates. They weren't particularly useful. Peacock meat is tough and not especially tasty, but they were beautiful and exotic. Having peacocks wandering your estate showed that you could afford to keep beautiful, impractical animals just for aesthetics. Peacocks were also served at fancy banquets, usually roasted and then redressed in their feathers as a display piece. Swans were royal birds in many medieval kingdoms. In England, all unmarked swans were property of the crown. You couldn't own a swan unless you had a royal grant giving you that right. Swan marks, distinctive notches, cut into swan beaks, indicated ownership. There were officials called swan-uppers whose job was to catch and mark swans annually. This system still exists in England today, though now it's more about conservation than property rights. The obsession with exotic animals wasn't just about wealth, it was about power over nature. Medieval nobles saw themselves as masters of creation, with the right to own and control animals from around the world. Menageries were demonstrations of dominion. They showed that the noble could bring the wildest, most dangerous beasts under his control. This also fed into medieval concepts of nobility and virtue. Being able to handle dangerous animals was seen as evidence of noble character. A true knight should be able to tame a falcon, ride a spirited horse, and face a lion bravely. Animal handling was part of noble education. Young nobles learned falconry, horsemanship, and hunting as essential skills that demonstrated their fitness to rule. What people did with animals in the Middle Ages. Part 3.3. Chapter 3. Feast Days and Animal Sacrifices. Medieval feast days were occasions of incredible excess, and animals played central roles in these celebrations. But we're not just talking about eating meat, though there was plenty of that. We're talking about elaborate displays, symbolic sacrifices, and rituals that transformed ordinary livestock into sacred participants in religious drama. Christmas was the biggest feast of the year, and the animals slaughtered for Christmas dinners were treated with special significance. The Yule boar was a particularly important tradition in Northern Europe. A boar would be selected months in advance and fattened specifically for the Christmas feast. This wasn't just any pig, it was the pig, a ceremonial animal that represented prosperity and abundance. On Christmas Eve, the boar would be paraded through the village before being slaughtered. The head would be prepared separately, often boiled, and then decorated with bay leaves, rosemary, and an apple in its mouth. The boar's head would be carried into the feast hall on a silver platter while singers performed the Boar's Head Carol. This wasn't just dinner, it was theater. The boar represented the old year being vanquished, pagan traditions being overcome by Christianity, and the abundance that the new year would bring. Some noble households took this tradition to extremes. There are records of boars being dressed in cloth of gold before being slaughtered, essentially clothing the animal in fabric worth more than a peasant would earn in a lifetime. The boar might be blessed by a priest before death, sanctifying it for the holy feast. This was conspicuous consumption as religious ritual. Oxen were roasted whole for major feast days in large communities. Entire oxen would be mounted on enormous spits, and roasted over open fires for hours or even days. The roasting of the ox was a public event. People would gather to watch, to smell the cooking meat, and to anticipate the feast. For poor people who rarely ate meat, the smell alone was probably intoxicating. When the ox was finally ready, it would be carved in a ceremonial manner. The lord, or the highest-ranking person present, would get the first cut. Then portions would be distributed according to social rank. The best cuts went to the nobility, lesser cuts to merchants and craftsmen, and the scraps to the poor. Even in feasting, the social hierarchy was reinforced. You could tell someone's status by which part of the ox they received. Swans were the ultimate feast bird for the nobility. Roasted swan was a dish that screamed wealth and power, because swans were royal birds. Preparing swan for a feast was an art form. The bird would be skinned carefully, keeping the feathers and skin intact. After roasting, the swan would be redressed in its own feathers and presented at the table as if it were still alive, wings spread, beak open. Sometimes gold leaf would be applied to the beak and feet to make it even more spectacular. Peacocks received similar treatment. They'd be skinned, roasted, and then refeathered for presentation. The tail feathers would be arranged in a full fan display. Some recipes specified that the peacock should be stuffed with expensive spices and smaller birds. A peacock stuffed with chickens, stuffed with quails, each layer adding to the extravagance. The goal was to create a centerpiece that was more art than food. These elaborate bird presentations served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the host's wealth. You had to be rich to afford swans and peacocks, and even richer to afford the cooks who could prepare them this way. They amazed guests with spectacle, and they created Instagram-worthy moments. If Instagram had existed in the Middle Ages, people talked about elaborate feast displays for years afterward. But feast days weren't just about consumption, they were about sacrifice and offering. On certain holy days, animals would be blessed and then slaughtered as offerings to God. This was a Christian adaptation of ancient sacrificial practices. The meat would ultimately be eaten, but the act of slaughter was framed as a religious sacrifice, returning God's gifts to Him before consuming them. Lambs were particularly significant for Easter celebrations. The lamb represented Christ, the Lamb of God, so eating lamb at Easter was both symbolic and sacred. Special Easter lambs would be selected, blessed by priests, and then slaughtered in ways that minimized their suffering, because causing unnecessary pain to an animal representing Christ was blasphemous. The meat would be distributed to the community, with everyone receiving a portion of the blessed lamb. Some communities had traditions of animal parades on feast days. Decorated cattle, horses, and sheep would be led through streets in procession. The animals would be groomed, their horns gilded, flowers woven into their manes and fleece. They'd be paraded to the church for blessing, then through the town square, and finally to the feast location. This transformed ordinary livestock into sacred participants in religious celebration. The Feast of St. John the Baptist involved peculiar animal customs in some regions. In parts of France and Spain, cats were collected in sacks and thrown into bonfires as part of the celebration. This horrific practice was justified by the belief that cats were agents of the devil, and burning them purified the community and protected against evil. The screams of the burning cats were considered auspicious. The louder they screamed, the better the protection against demons. Kings and nobles would sometimes participate in these cat burnings personally, lighting the bonfires themselves. This wasn't seen as cruel, it was seen as righteous destruction of evil. Modern readers find this shocking, but medieval people genuinely believed they were fighting supernatural evil through these practices. The fact that they were actually just torturing animals didn't register because cats weren't seen as deserving of compassion. Bulls were central to certain regional festivals. In Spain, bull running and bullfighting traditions that continue today began in the Middle Ages, but these weren't quite the same as modern bullfighting. Medieval bull events were more chaotic and less ritualized. A bull would be released in a town square, and young men would attempt to fight it, dodge it, or simply survive its charge. Many people were injured or killed in these events, but they were considered tests of courage and manhood. Some religious festivals involved releasing animals as symbols of liberation. On certain saints' days, caged birds would be released as acts of charity and symbols of souls being freed from purgatory. People would buy caged birds specifically to release them during these ceremonies. The birds flying away represented prayers rising to heaven and souls ascending to paradise. Of course, many of these freed birds probably died shortly afterward because they were domesticated and couldn't survive in the wild, but the symbolism was what mattered. The act of releasing them was spiritually significant, regardless of the bird's actual fate. This is a perfect example of how medieval religious practice prioritized spiritual meaning over practical outcomes. Horses played ceremonial roles in knightly feast days and tournaments. A knight's horse would be decorated with heraldic colors, blessed before combat, and treated as an extension of the knight's own honor. If a knight was defeated in a tournament, his horse might be forfeited to the victor. Horses were so valuable and so important to knightly identity that losing your horse was almost as shameful as losing your armor or your sword. Some tournaments had specific rules about horses. Only certain breeds or sizes could be used. The horses had to meet standards of training and temperament. There were horse inspectors who examined the animals before tournaments to ensure compliance. All of this elevated the horse from simple transportation to a status symbol and a participant in chivalric ritual. Dogs had their own feast day traditions. On the feast of St. Hubert, the patron saint of hunters, hunting dogs would be blessed in elaborate ceremonies. The dogs would be brought to church, where priests would pray over them and sprinkle them with holy water. Some churches had special dog blessing rituals that involved the dogs entering the church itself, which must have been chaotic. Blessed hunting dogs were believed to be protected from injury, disease, and the attacks of wild animals. They would hunt better, track more accurately, and serve their masters more faithfully. Dog owners took this seriously. They'd pay significant fees to have their dogs blessed by priests who had a reputation for particularly effective blessings. There was a whole economy around dog blessings. Pigs, despite being accused of crimes and executed as we discussed earlier, also had positive roles in feast traditions. In some regions, a fattened pig would be led through town with ribbons and flowers before being slaughtered for a community feast. The pig represented communal prosperity. Everyone contributed to feeding the pig throughout the year, and everyone shared in eating it at the feast. This communal pig tradition reinforced social bonds. The feast wasn't just about food, it was about the community coming together, sharing resources, and celebrating their collective survival through another year. The pig was the vehicle for that celebration, transformed from ordinary livestock into a symbol of community solidarity. Geese were traditional Michaelmas, September 29th fare. The Michaelmas goose was as significant as the Christmas turkey is today. Geese would be fattened through summer and early autumn, then slaughtered for the Michaelmas feast. Eating goose on Michaelmas was believed to bring good luck and prosperity for the coming year. Tenants would often give geese to their landlords as part of their rent payment on this day. The association between geese and Michaelmas came from multiple sources. St. Michael, whose feast day it was often depicted standing on a defeated dragon or demon. Geese, being aggressive and territorial, were seen as fighting birds that would attack serpents. Therefore, eating goose on St. Michael's feast day was a way of symbolically participating in the battle against evil. You were literally consuming the enemy of demons. Fish feast days were equally elaborate, despite being fast days. Just because you couldn't eat meat didn't mean you couldn't feast. Wealthy households would serve elaborate fish courses: lamprey eel pies, sturgeon salmon, pike prepared in expensive sauces. Poor people ate herring and dried cod, but even these were prepared specially for feast days. The lamprey eel was particularly prized. These parasitic fish were considered a delicacy, especially lamprey pie. Henry VI of England allegedly died from eating a surfeit of lampreys, essentially eating so many lamprey eels that it killed him. This didn't stop other nobles from gorging on lamprey. If anything, it made lamprey more prestigious. You had to be really wealthy to eat enough lamprey to die from it. Sturgeon was another royal fish. In England, all sturgeon caught in British waters were property of the crown. If a fisherman caught a sturgeon, he was legally required to offer it to the king. The king might decline and let the fisherman keep it, but the offer had to be made. This law still exists in Britain today, though it's rarely enforced. Feast days also involved animal entertainment that modern people would find disturbing. Bear baiting and bull baiting were common feast day entertainments. An animal, usually a bear or bull, would be chained in a pit or arena. Dogs would be released to attack it. The animal would fight for its life while spectators bet on the outcome and cheered. This wasn't considered cruel entertainment, it was considered normal. People brought their children to watch. Churches held bear baitings as fundraisers. The animal's suffering was part of the entertainment. The more the animal fought, the better the show. Bears that fought particularly well became famous and were transported between towns for different events. Some feast days involved animal races. Pigs would race through streets, and whoever caught the pig could keep it. This created chaos as people chased terrified pigs through medieval towns. It was considered hilarious entertainment. The pig, of course, was running for its life, but that was part of the fun from the spectator's perspective. Cockfighting was popular feast day entertainment across all social classes. Roosters would be fitted with sharp spurs and placed in a ring to fight to the death. Spectators would bet on the outcome. Schools sometimes held cockfighting events, and the admission fees would go to the schoolmaster. Children were encouraged to attend to learn about bravery and fighting spirit. The roosters' deaths were teaching tools. Horse racing on feast days was more organized and less cruel, though still dangerous for the horses. Medieval horse races were rougher than modern races. Fewer rules, more contact between riders, tracks that were often just fields or roads. Horses were sometimes injured or killed, but they were valuable enough that owners tried to protect them. Still, the prestige of winning a feast day race often outweighed concerns about the horse's safety. All of these feast traditions, the elaborate food presentations, the animal blessings, the entertainments, the communal meals, served to mark time and create shared experiences. Medieval people didn't have vacations or weekends in the modern sense. Feast days were their breaks from ordinary life, and animals were central to making those breaks special. Whether as food, as symbols, as entertainment, or as participants in ritual, animals transformed feast days from ordinary time into sacred time. Part 5. Animals in Warfare and Work. Chapter 1. War horses and military animals. War horses were the medieval equivalent of tanks. Expensive, powerful, and absolutely essential for mounted knights. But the relationship between knight and horse was more than just practical. It was emotional, spiritual, and deeply embedded in chivalric culture. A knight without a horse was like a pilot without a plane, technically still trained for combat but unable to fulfill his primary function. The destrier was the premier medieval war horse. These weren't the massive draft horses that people often imagine. Medieval war horses were more like modern warm-blood sport horses, strong enough to carry a knight in armor, but agile enough for combat maneuvers. They were bred for temperament as much as size. A good destrier needed to be brave, in battle, responsive to commands, even in chaos, and aggressive toward enemy horses and infantry. Training a destrier took years and required specialized trainers. Young horses were gradually introduced to the sights, sounds, and sensations of battle. They'd be exposed to loud noises, flashing weapons, crowds of people. They'd learn to kick on command, to turn rapidly, to charge without hesitation. The best war horses would bite and kick enemy soldiers, functioning as weapons themselves, not just transportation. These horses were incredibly valuable. A top-quality destrier could cost as much as a village. Knights sometimes owned land, specifically to support their horses. The horse had to be fed high-quality grain, housed in good stables attended by grooms and farriers. This wasn't just about keeping the animal healthy, it was an investment in military capability. Knights formed deep bonds with their war horses. Medieval literature is full of stories about knights grieving over dead horses, refusing to ride any other mount, or performing great deeds to avenge a fallen horse. Some knights had their horses buried with honors, their names recorded, their service commemorated. This wasn't seen as excessive sentimentality. It was appropriate respect for a battle companion. When a war horse died in battle, it wasn't just an economic loss, it was a personal tragedy. Knights would mourn their horses genuinely. Some wrote elegies for dead horses. Others commissioned prayers for their horses' souls, even though Christian theology didn't support the idea that horses had souls. The emotional connection overrode theological technicalities. But horses weren't the only military animals. Dogs were used extensively in medieval warfare, though not always in ways modern people expect. War dogs weren't primarily used as direct combatants, though they sometimes were. More often, they served as guards, scouts, and psychological weapons. Mastiffs and similar large dogs would be armored and sent charging at enemy lines. A pack of armored dogs running at you was terrifying, even if the dogs weren't particularly effective at actually killing soldiers. They disrupted formations, caused panic, and could bring down horses. Some armies had specialized dog handlers whose only job was managing war dogs. Guard dogs patrolled camps and fortifications at night. They'd alert soldiers to approaching enemies, detect infiltrators, and sometimes attack intruders directly. Dogs' superior hearing and sense of smell made them better sentries than humans in many situations. Medieval military manuals include instructions for training and deploying guard dogs. Hunting dogs doubled as military scouts. They could track enemy movements through forests, detect ambushes, and find hidden enemies. Their ability to follow scent trails made them invaluable for reconnaissance. In an era before sophisticated surveillance technology, a good tracking dog might prevent an army from walking into an ambush. Elephants were used in warfare in some regions where they were available, though less commonly in medieval Europe. We mentioned Frederick II's elephants earlier, but they appeared in other medieval conflicts too. The psychological impact of elephants was enormous. Soldiers who had never seen an elephant before would often break and run. The elephant didn't even have to fight. Just appearing on the battlefield could win the day. However, elephants had significant drawbacks. They were difficult to transport, expensive to feed, and hard to control in battle. If an elephant panicked, it would rampage through your own lines as easily as the enemy's. Wounded elephants were particularly dangerous. Despite these problems, rulers kept trying to use elephants because when they worked spectacularly. Camels saw military use in regions where they were common, particularly in conflicts involving Middle Eastern armies. Camels had the advantage of terrifying horses that weren't accustomed to them. The smell and appearance of camels could cause enemy cavalry to panic and become uncontrollable. This made camels useful even if they weren't particularly effective as direct combat mounts. Some armies used mules and donkeys as pack animals to transport supplies. This wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Medieval armies needed enormous amounts of supplies: food, water, weapons, armor, tents, cooking equipment. Pack animals made it possible to move these supplies over rough terrain where wagons couldn't go. An army with good pack animals could campaign in areas that would otherwise be inaccessible. Oxen pulled supply wagons and siege equipment. Moving a medieval army required hundreds or thousands of wagons filled with supplies. Oxen were strong, relatively cheap, and could survive on rougher forage than horses. They were slower than horses, which limited how quickly an army could move, but they were reliable. Many medieval military campaigns succeeded or failed based on the availability and health of oxen. Siege warfare involved animals in creative ways. During sieges, defenders sometimes dropped heavy stones or poured boiling water on attackers, but they also used animals. Dead animals would be catapulted into besieged cities to spread disease and lower morale. This was early biological warfare. A rotting cow carcass landing in your town square was both disgusting and potentially deadly. Besiegers did the same thing in reverse. They'd catapult dead animals over walls to spread disease among defenders. Sometimes they'd use diseased animals specifically, trying to start epidemics. This was based on the correct observation that dead animals spread disease, even though medieval people didn't understand the mechanism. Defenders also used animals more actively. Heated sand would be poured on attackers from walls, painful but not lethal. But defenders also dumped beehives on attackers climbing siege ladders. Imagine scaling a ladder in full armor while hundreds of angry bees attack any exposed skin. Beehives were effective, cheap, and reusable if you could recover them after. Some defenders kept geese as alarm systems. Geese are aggressive and territorial, and they make a lot of noise when disturbed. Roman defenders famously used geese to alert them to a sneak attack. Medieval defenders adopted this practice. Geese were cheaper than guards and more reliable in some ways. They couldn't fall asleep or be bribed. Pigeons served as messengers, carrying notes between armies or from armies back to home bases. Carrier pigeons could fly quickly over terrain that would take days for a human messenger to cross. They could evade enemy interception more easily than human messengers. The messages they carried were tiny, written on thin paper and attached to the bird's leg, but even short messages could be strategically valuable. Training carrier pigeons required patience and expertise. Young pigeons had to be gradually trained to fly longer and longer distances, always returning to their home roost. The pigeons had to be transported to the field in cages, then released with messages attached. If the pigeon was killed or lost, the message was lost. But when it worked, it was one of the fastest communication methods available. Some medieval armies used animals for psychological warfare in more creative ways. There are accounts of armies tying torches to animals and driving them toward enemy camps at night. Cattle, donkeys, or horses with burning materials attached would stampede toward the enemy, creating chaos and fear. The animals would die, but the tactic could disrupt enemy formations or break sieges. Others used animals as decoys. Dressed up livestock might be paraded at a distance to make an army seem larger than it actually was. From far away, cows in cloth coverings might look like cavalry. This could deceive enemy scouts about the size and composition of your forces. It was low-tech military deception, but it sometimes worked. War horses were also status symbols that affected military tactics. A knight's honor was tied to his horse and equipment. Knights on inferior horses or without horses were mocked and dishonored. This created pressure to own the best horses possible, which drove up prices and made warfare even more expensive. Only the wealthy could afford to be proper knights, which reinforced the social hierarchy. When knights were captured in battle, their horses were often taken as ransom. Capturing a valuable war horse could be more profitable than capturing the knight himself in some cases. This led to interesting dynamics, where knights might fight desperately to protect their horses, sometimes more desperately than they fought to protect themselves. Horse armor became increasingly elaborate in later medieval periods. Horses were fitted with metal barding that protected their heads, necks, and chests. This armor was expensive and heavy. A fully armored horse and knight together might weigh over 400 pounds of metal. The horse had to be exceptionally strong and well-trained to carry this load into battle. The armoring of horses created a medieval arms race. As horses got more protection, weapons designed to kill horses became more powerful. Pole arms, specifically designed to unseat knights by killing their horses, were developed. Archers aimed for horses rather than knights, because horses were larger, easier targets, and because killing the horse effectively removed the knight from combat. This led to interesting tactical decisions. Knights knew their horses were vulnerable, so they sometimes fought on foot, using their horses only for transportation to the battlefield. Other times, the psychological and tactical advantages of mounted combat outweighed the risk to the horse. The decision depended on terrain, enemy composition, and the individual knight's judgment. Chapter 2: Working Animals and Daily Labor Beyond. Warfare. Animals were the engines of medieval economy. Everything from plowing fields to grinding grain to transporting goods depended on animal power. The medieval world ran on animals the way the modern world runs on electricity. Oxen were the primary plow animals throughout most of medieval Europe. They were strong, patient, and could work long hours, pulling heavy plows through difficult soil. A peasant's oxen were his most valuable possession after his land. Losing an ox to disease or injury could ruin a family economically. The entire year's planting might be jeopardized. Plowing was grueling work for both the oxen and the plowman. The ox would pull the plow through heavy soil for hours, while the plowman guided it and managed the plow. On stony or root-filled ground, this was exhausting for the animal. Oxen that worked hard during planting season lost significant weight and condition. They had to be rested and fed well afterward to recover. Most peasants couldn't afford to own enough oxen for efficient plowing. A good plow team needed multiple oxen, sometimes 6 or 8 for heavy soil. This led to cooperative arrangements where multiple families would pool their oxen to create plow teams. They'd take turns using the full team, plowing each family's fields in sequence. This cooperation was essential for survival, but also created social dynamics and potential conflicts. Horses were faster than oxen and could work longer hours, but they were more expensive to maintain. Horses needed better food than oxen, grain rather than just grass. They needed shoes, which oxen typically didn't. They were more prone to injury and disease, but in regions where horses were used for plowing, they could get significantly more work done per day than oxen. The choice between horses and oxen depended on economics, terrain, and local tradition. Wealthier farmers could afford horses and the feed they required. Poorer farmers relied on oxen. Some regions used both, matching the animal to the specific task. Heavy clay soils might require oxen's strength, while lighter soils suited horses' speed. Donkeys and mules served as pack animals and light draft animals. They were cheaper to maintain than horses, more sure-footed in rough terrain, and more resistant to many diseases. A peasant who couldn't afford a horse might own a donkey for transportation and light farm work. Donkeys carried goods to market, pulled small carts, and performed various tasks around the farm. Mules, the hybrid offspring of horses and donkeys, combined advantages of both. They were stronger than donkeys and more economical than horses. They were also stubborn, which was both an advantage and a disadvantage. A mule wouldn't work itself to death the way a horse might, but it also wouldn't cooperate if it decided it didn't want to do something. Water power from rivers was important in medieval economy, but it required animals to transport grain to watermills and flour back. Horses, donkeys, and oxen spent their days hauling sacks of grain to mills and bringing back flour. This transportation network was essential for food production. Without animals to move grain, watermills would have been useless. Some mills used animal power directly. Horse mills, or ox mills, used animals walking in circles to turn millstones. The animal would be harnessed to a long beam connected to the grinding mechanism. It would walk round and round, hour after hour, turning the millstone. This was monotonous work for the animal, but it produced flour where water power wasn't available. Dogs pulled small carts in some regions, especially in areas where larger animals were too expensive. Dog carts were common in market towns. Merchants would use teams of dogs to pull carts loaded with goods. The dogs were strong enough to pull significant weight, cheap to feed compared to horses, and could navigate narrow streets that would challenge larger animals. Goats and sheep provided not just meat and milk, but wool for textile production. Sheep farming was one of medieval Europe's most important industries. Wool from sheep was spun into thread, woven into cloth, and exported across Europe. Entire economies depended on sheep. The wealth of medieval England was literally built on sheep's backs. Shepherds spent their lives managing flocks, moving them between pastures, protecting them from predators, and shearing them for wool. It was lonely, difficult work. Shepherds lived apart from villages, sometimes for months at a time, with only their dogs and sheep for company. The relationship between shepherd and sheepdog was crucial. A good dog could control a flock that would be unmanageable for a human alone. Sheepdogs were trained from puppyhood to work with sheep. They learned to herd sheep without injuring them, to respond to verbal and whistle commands, to work at a distance from the shepherd. A well-trained sheepdog was valuable property. Some shepherds would sell or trade dogs, and a dog with proven herding ability could command a high price. Pigs were semi-wild in many medieval contexts. They'd be released into forests to forage for acorns and roots, fattening themselves on natural food. Swineherds would manage these semi-wild pig herds, preventing them from wandering too far and protecting them from predators. In autumn, the pigs would be rounded up and slaughtered for winter food. This system of forest pig management was so important that rights to let pigs forage in forests were carefully regulated. Lords controlled forest access and charged fees for pannage, the right to let your pigs forage in the forest. Disputes over pannage rights could become serious conflicts. Your pigs eating acorns in the Lord's forest without permission was theft. Cattle provided milk, meat, leather, and labor. Dairy cows were milked daily, providing the primary source of protein for many families. The milk would be made into cheese and butter, which could be stored. Fresh milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration, so most milk was preserved through fermentation or churning. Milking was typically women's work in medieval society. Women would milk cows early morning and evening, process the milk into cheese and butter, and manage the dairy production. This was skilled work that required the knowledge of fermentation, temperature control, and timing. A good dairymaid could significantly increase a household's food supply and income. Chickens provided eggs and meat, but they also served pest control. Chickens eat insects, small rodents, and various pests that damage crops and stored food. A flock of chickens roaming a farm would reduce pest populations naturally. They turned waste and pests into eggs and meat, making them extremely efficient livestock. Managing chickens was usually assigned to children or women. Children would collect eggs, feed chickens, and protect them from predators. This taught basic animal husbandry skills and provided children with productive work. Chickens were small enough that children could manage them without the danger posed by larger livestock. Geese were raised for meat, eggs, and feathers. Goose feathers were used for quills, pillows, and fletching arrows. Geese also served as guard animals. They're aggressive and loud when strangers approach. Many farms kept geese partly as an alarm system. Their honking would alert the household to visitors or intruders. Goose girls, young women assigned to tend geese, appear frequently in medieval records and later folklore. Tending geese was considered light work suitable for young girls. They'd lead flocks to good grazing areas, keep them together, and protect them from foxes and other predators. This work kept girls productive while teaching them responsibility. Cats controlled rodent populations in granaries and homes. Medieval people had a complicated relationship with cats, as we've discussed, but they recognized cats' utility. A good mouse or cat could save significant amounts of stored grain by killing rats and mice. Ships carried cats to control rodents in cargo holds. Some monasteries kept cats specifically for rodent control in their libraries and scriptoriums. Mice and rats would eat parchment, bindings, and stored manuscripts. Cats protected these valuable materials. There are marginal notes in medieval manuscripts where monks mention their cats, sometimes affectionately, sometimes frustratedly, when the cat walked across wet ink. Ferrets were used for hunting rabbits. A ferret would be sent into a rabbit burrow to drive the rabbits out, where hunters waited with nets or dogs. Ferret hunting was common because rabbits were important food sources, but also destructive to crops. Controlling rabbit populations protected agriculture while providing meat. Bees, as we've discussed, provided honey and wax, but they were also agricultural workers in a sense. They pollinated crops, though medieval. People didn't understand this. Beekeeping was a specialized skill. Some monasteries had dedicated beekeepers whose only job was managing hives and processing honey and wax. Hawks and falcons hunted game birds and small animals for their owners. Falconry was sport for the nobility, but it was also practical hunting. A trained hawk could catch birds that would be difficult to hunt with other methods. The meat the hawk caught supplemented the household's diet, making falconry both recreation and food production. Every type of working animal required specific knowledge and skills to manage effectively. Medieval people developed sophisticated understanding of animal behavior, health, and training through practical experience. This knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship and family teaching. A good stockman, shepherd, or plowman was respected for their expertise. The rhythm of medieval life followed the rhythms of animal needs. Cows had to be milked on schedule. Oxen had to be fed and rested properly to work the next day. Chickens had to be locked up at night to protect them from foxes. Horses needed shoeing every few weeks. The working day was structured around animal care as much as human needs. When working animals died or became too old to work, it was an economic crisis. Replacing an ox or a plow horse required significant capital that peasants often didn't have. This led to animals being worked longer than was perhaps healthy for them, pushed to continue laboring, even when aging or injured. The economic necessity overrode animal welfare considerations. Some animals received better care than others based on their economic value. A knight's destrier would be pampered and carefully maintained. A peasant's plow ox would be valued and protected as much as the peasant's resources allowed. But a pig or chicken was expendable, easily replaced, and less valuable individually. The level of care an animal received directly reflected its economic importance to the owner. Chapter 3: Animals and Transportation. Medieval transportation was entirely dependent on animals. Everything moved by animal power or not at all. This shaped medieval economy, society, and geography in fundamental ways. Horses were the primary transportation for anyone who could afford them. A decent riding horse could cover 30-40 miles per day with a rider. Faster horses could do 50-60 miles, though this was hard on the animal and couldn't be sustained for multiple days. These travel speeds determined how far apart medieval towns could be while maintaining regular contact. The quality of your horse signaled your social status as clearly as the clothes you wore. Nobility rode fine horses with expensive tack and decorative equipment. Merchants rode solid, reliable horses that could carry them and their goods. Poor people didn't ride horses at all. They walked. You could tell someone's social rank at a glance by what they rode. Different types of horses served different purposes. Palfreys were smooth-riding horses, preferred for long-distance travel. Their gait was comfortable for riders spending hours in the saddle. Coursers were fast horses, used for hunting and battle. Rounceys were all-purpose horses, used by less wealthy riders. Each type was bred for specific characteristics. Women of nobility rode side saddle, or in enclosed litters carried by horses. This was dictated by concerns about modesty and propriety. Women riding astride was considered scandalous in many periods and regions. The side saddle required significant skill to use safely, and riding side saddle long distances was uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous. Litters and carriages pulled by horses were used by the wealthy for comfort and status display. An elaborate carriage with multiple horses was a moving advertisement of wealth. The most expensive carriages were fitted with cushions, curtains, and decorations. Traveling in a carriage was slow and uncomfortable by modern standards. Medieval roads were terrible, but it was still preferable to walking. Carts and wagons, pulled by oxen or horses, transported goods between cities. Merchant caravans would assemble with multiple wagons, traveling together for safety. The wagons would be loaded with trade goods, food supplies for the journey, and camping equipment. These caravans moved slowly, maybe 15-20 miles per day, but they could transport massive amounts of goods. The roads these wagons traveled on were often barely roads at all. Many were just dirt tracks that became muddy in rain and dusty in dry weather. Deep ruts from wagon wheels made travel difficult. Bridges were rare, so river crossings required fording through the water, which could be dangerous for heavily loaded wagons and the animals pulling them. Maintaining roads was supposed to be a communal responsibility, but it was often neglected. Local lords were supposed to maintain roads through their territory, but many didn't bother unless the road was important for their own purposes. This meant major trade routes were relatively well maintained, while minor roads were terrible. Pack animals, horses, mules, and donkeys, loaded with goods, could travel where wagons couldn't. They could navigate narrow mountain paths, ford deeper rivers, and move through forests without roads. Pack trains of dozens or hundreds of animals would carry goods across difficult terrain. Each animal could carry 100-200 pounds, depending on its size and strength. Leading a pack train required skill. The animals had to be loaded carefully, so the weight was balanced and secure. They had to be led in the right order. Experienced animals in front, newer animals following. They had to be watched for signs of lameness or injury. A pack train leader who lost animals or goods to accidents or theft would lose his reputation and livelihood. Camels were used in regions where they were available, particularly for desert travel. A camel could carry more weight than a horse or mule, go longer without water, and handle extreme temperatures. Camel caravans crossing deserts were essential for long-distance trade between Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Silk Road depended on camels. Water transportation was often more efficient than land transportation. Boats could carry much more cargo than animal-drawn wagons. Rivers and canals served as highways for bulk goods, but boats still depended on animals. Horses or oxen walked along riverbanks pulling barges upstream. This towpath system allowed boats to move against current without relying entirely on human rowing. Coastal shipping was even more efficient for bulk cargo. Ships could carry thousands of pounds of goods, far more than any animal-powered land transport. But getting goods from inland areas to ports still required animal transportation. The medieval economy was a network of different transportation modes, with animals providing the crucial links. The speed of animal transportation limited the spread of information. News could only travel as fast as a horse could run. A rider with an important message might kill multiple horses, riding them to exhaustion and switching to fresh mounts. The fastest recorded medieval message delivery was about 200 miles in a day, but this was exceptional and required a relay system with fresh horses waiting at intervals. This communication speed shaped medieval politics and warfare. A king might not learn about an invasion until weeks after it happened. Orders sent to distant territories might arrive too late to be useful. Generals made decisions based on outdated information because newer intelligence couldn't reach them quickly enough. The speed of horses determined the speed of everything. Postal systems using relay riders were established in some regions. Fresh horses would be stationed at intervals along major routes. A messenger would ride one horse to exhaustion, switch to a fresh horse, and continue. This allowed messages to travel much faster than a single rider and horse could manage. But these systems were expensive and only existed along the most important routes. Winter weather severely disrupted animal transportation. Snow and ice made roads impassable for wagons. Horses couldn't travel safely in icy conditions. Rivers froze, stopping boat traffic. Medieval economic activity slowed dramatically in winter, partly because transportation became so difficult. Regions stocked up on supplies in autumn because winter travel was unreliable. Merchants planned their travels around seasons for this reason. Major trading expeditions happened in spring through fall when weather and roads were better. Winter was for staying put, selling existing inventory, and planning next year's expeditions. The medieval economy had an annual rhythm dictated by animal transportation capabilities. Tolls and fees for crossing bridges, using roads, or entering cities were based on the number of animals and amount of goods transported. A merchant with a wagon pulled by 4 oxen and loaded with goods would pay more than a peddler with a single-packed donkey. These fees were significant costs for merchants and affected the prices of transported goods. Some regions had toll collectors at every bridge and major crossroad. Traveling merchants might pay tolls dozens of times on a single journey. This made long-distance trade expensive and encouraged the development of alternative routes that avoided toll points. Toll avoidance was a major consideration in route planning. Banditry was a constant threat for travelers. Robbers would target merchant caravans, pilgrims, and other travelers. The animals themselves were often valuable loot. Stealing a merchant's horses could be as profitable as stealing his goods. This made traveling alone dangerous. Merchants grouped together for safety, and the wealthy traveled with armed guards. The animals' needs dictated travel schedules. Horses and oxen needed rest, food, and water. A heavily loaded wagon couldn't travel more than a few hours before the animals needed a break. Travel days were structured around finding water sources and grazing areas for the animals. This meant you couldn't just travel continuously. The animals' biological needs created mandatory stops. Inns and stables developed along major routes to serve travelers and their animals. A good inn provided not just beds and food for travelers, but stables, feed, and care for their animals. Innkeepers who neglected animals would lose business because travelers depended on their animals' health. Some inns became famous for excellent horse care, attracting merchants who valued their animals. The economic importance of transportation animals created entire supporting industries. Farriers who shoed horses, harness makers who created tack and wagon equipment, veterinarians who treated sick animals, grooms who cared for animals. All of these professions existed because of the dependence on animal transportation. Blacksmiths forged horseshoes customized to individual horses' hooves. A well-fitted shoe could mean the difference between a horse that could work daily and one that went lame. Shoeing was skilled work, and good farriers commanded respect and good pay. Horses needed new shoes every 4-6 weeks, creating steady demand for farrier services. Saddle makers and harness makers created the equipment that made riding and driving possible. A well-made saddle fit the horse comfortably while giving the rider security and control. Poor saddles could injure horses or cause riders to fall. The best saddle makers were artists, whose work was both functional and beautiful. The medieval world's complete dependence on animal transportation meant that animal diseases could cause economic catastrophes. An epidemic that killed horses in a region would disrupt trade, prevent agricultural work, and potentially cause famine. Protecting animal health was economic necessity. This vulnerability meant that people paid attention to animal health in ways modern people might not expect. Sick animals were serious problems. Treatments that seem bizarre to us, blessing animals, using folk remedies, isolating sick animals, were rational responses to real economic threats. Part 6. The Strange Science of Bestiaries. Chapter 4. What medieval people thought animals. Where medieval people had wildly different ideas about animals than we do today. They didn't think of animals as purely biological organisms. Animals were symbols, messages from God, moral lessons, and scientific subjects all at once. This led to some truly bizarre beliefs about animal nature and behavior. Bestiaries were illustrated books describing animals and their characteristics. They were part natural history, part theology, part moral instruction. A typical bestiary entry would describe an animal's appearance and behavior, then explain what moral or spiritual lesson humans should learn from it. The accuracy of the animal descriptions varied wildly. Lions were described as sleeping with their eyes open, which is false. But this false characteristic was used to teach that Christians should be spiritually vigilant, always watching for sin even when resting. The lion also supposedly erased its tracks with its tail when pursued, teaching Christians to hide their good deeds from pride. And lion cubs were supposedly born dead, brought to life after 3 days by their father's roar, symbolizing Christ's resurrection. None of this is true about actual lions, but medieval people didn't care. The point wasn't accurate zoology. It was spiritual truth conveyed through animal symbolism. Whether lions actually slept with eyes open was less important than the lesson about vigilance. Pelicans were believed to feed their young with blood from their own breasts when food was scarce. This absolutely doesn't happen. Pelicans feed their chicks, regurgitated fish like normal birds. But the mythical, self-sacrificing pelican became a symbol of Christ's sacrifice. Churches used pelican imagery in art because of this symbolic meaning, not because anyone thought pelicans actually did this. Elephants were described as having no knee joints, which meant they couldn't lie down. They supposedly slept, leaning against trees. Hunters would partially saw through the tree, so when the elephant leaned against it, the tree would break, and the elephant would fall and be unable to get up. This is completely false. Elephants have knees and lie down regularly, but the moral lesson was clear. The elephant represented humanity after the fall. Like the elephant leaning on a weak tree, humans lean on worldly things that can't support them. When those false supports fail, humans fall into sin and can't rise without God's help, represented by other elephants coming to help the fallen elephant in some versions. Beavers were believed to castrate themselves when hunted. The beaver supposedly knew hunters wanted its testicles, which were valued in medicine, so it would bite off its own testicles and throw them at the hunters, who would then leave it alone. If a beaver that had already done this was hunted again, it would show the hunters it had no testicles, and they'd leave it alone. This is nonsense. Beavers don't do this, but the moral lesson was that Christians should castrate themselves spiritually, cut away sinful desires to escape the devil's hunting. The beaver's self-mutilation symbolized spiritual discipline and self-denial. Barnacle geese, as mentioned earlier, were believed to hatch from barnacles growing on driftwood. This allowed them to be classified as fish for fasting purposes, but it also created weird theological questions. If barnacle geese weren't born from eggs laid by parent birds, did they have the same moral status as other creatures? Were they even really alive in the normal sense? Some theologians got very worked up about barnacle geese. If they didn't reproduce sexually, were they products of spontaneous generation? If so, did they have souls? Could they sin? These seem like ridiculous questions, but medieval thinkers took them seriously because classification mattered in their worldview. Bears were supposedly born as formless lumps that the mother bear had to lick into shape. Licking into shape, as a phrase, comes from this belief. The baby bear started as an amorphous blob, and the mother's licking literally sculpted it into bear form. This symbolized how education and upbringing shaped children. Parents had to lick their cubs into shape. This is obviously false. Bear cubs are born as small but fully formed bears, but the image was powerful and the metaphor useful, so the belief persisted even when people could observe real bear cubs. Crocodiles were believed to weep while eating their victims. Crocodile tears, false sorrow, comes from this belief. The crocodile would cry as if sad while devouring its prey. This symbolized hypocrites who pretended to be sorry for their sins while continuing to commit them. Medieval preachers loved this image. Crocodiles do have glands that produce moisture around their eyes, which can look like tears. So there's a kernel of truth here, but the interpretation is completely anthropomorphized. Crocodiles aren't feeling sorry, it's just physiology. Basilisks were serpents that could kill with their gaze or breath. They were supposedly born from eggs laid by roosters and incubated by toads. This is why that rooster we discussed earlier was executed for laying an egg. It could produce a basilisk. The basilisk represented sin or the devil, something so poisonous that even looking at it could destroy you. No such creature exists, obviously, but medieval people included basilisks in bestiaries, alongside real animals like horses and dogs. The distinction between real and mythical animals wasn't sharp. If something appeared in authoritative texts, it was treated as real. Dragons were described in detail in bestiaries. They had specific characteristics. They were enormous serpents, sometimes with wings. They lived in caves. They had poisonous breath. Dragons represented the devil or sin in Christian symbolism. St. George and other dragon-slaying saints were killing spiritual evil, not literal monsters, though many medieval people believed both. Spiritual symbolism and literal dragon slaying could coexist. Unicorns could only be captured by virgin women. A unicorn would approach a virgin, lay its head in her lap, and fall asleep, whereupon hunters could capture it. This made the unicorn a symbol of Christ, who could only be captured through the Virgin Mary. The sexual overtones of this symbolism made some medieval theologians uncomfortable, but the tradition was too established to abandon. Unicorns were believed to be real animals. Medieval people thought unicorns lived in distant lands and were simply rare. The unicorn horns, actually narwhal tusks, that appeared in Europe proved their existence. These horns were immensely valuable, and owning one was tremendous status symbol. Nobody questioned whether unicorns were real when you could buy their horns. Phoenix birds supposedly lived for hundreds of years, then built a nest of spices and set themselves on fire. From the ashes, a new phoenix would be reborn. This symbolized resurrection and eternal life. The phoenix appeared on early Christian tombs and in churches as a symbol of Christ's resurrection. Medieval people debated whether phoenixes were real. Some thought they were mythical. Others believed they existed, but were extremely rare. Still others thought there was only one phoenix in the world at a time. The existence of the phoenix wasn't proven or disproven. It existed in a liminal space between myth and reality. Manticores had human faces, lion bodies, and scorpion, tails that could shoot poisonous spikes. They supposedly spoke with flute-like voices that lured victims close before devouring them. Manticores represented temptation and seduction, evil that appeared beautiful and alluring before destroying you. These creatures were described with the same serious tone and systematic detail as real animals. A bestiary might have an entry on manticores right next to an entry on bears, with no indication that one was mythical and the other real. The text treated both as equally factual. This wasn't stupidity or gullibility. Medieval people had a different epistemology, a different way of knowing what was true. Written authority was more convincing than personal observation in many cases. If respected ancient texts said manticores existed, that was evidence. If no one you knew had personally seen a manticore, well, the world was big, and you hadn't seen most of it. Aspidocholon was a whale-like creature so huge that sailors mistook it for an island. They'd land on its back and light fires to cook their food. The heat would wake the creature, which would dive, drowning the sailors. This symbolized the devil, something that looked safe and attractive, but led to destruction. Some medieval sailors genuinely believed in Aspidocholon. Whales large enough to be mistaken for islands at a distance do exist, though they don't let people land on them. But the story persisted because it served as warning. Don't trust appearances. Verify before committing, and always be vigilant for hidden dangers. Griffins had eagle heads and wings with lion bodies. They supposedly guarded golden mountains and built nests of gold. Griffins represented divine power and guardianship. They appeared in church architecture as protectors and symbols of Christ's dual nature. Divine like the eagle, earthly like the lion. Did medieval people believe in griffins? It varied. Educated scholars knew they were symbolic. Common people might have believed. They were real. Artists depicted them as real in marginal notes and decorations, but that doesn't prove belief. The line between symbol and reality was blurry in ways modern people find hard to grasp. Salamanders supposedly lived in fire and couldn't be burned. They were used as symbols of faith that survives trials, of purity that resists corruption. Salamanders appeared in books about alchemy and natural philosophy as creatures of elemental fire. Real salamanders are amphibians that can't survive in fire, but the myth was more powerful than reality. Medieval natural philosophy often preferred coherent systems of correspondences over empirical observation. If the four elements, earth, air, fire, water, existed, then there should be creatures that embodied each element. Salamanders had to exist in fire to complete the system. The logic of the system outweighed observation. These bestiary animals weren't just curiosities. They were tools for teaching theology, ethics, and natural philosophy. Preachers used bestiary examples in sermons, teachers used them to illustrate moral lessons. The animals were part of a unified Christian worldview where natural and supernatural, real and symbolic, all fit together coherently. Modern people sometimes laugh at medieval bestiaries as evidence of medieval ignorance. But bestiaries represented a sophisticated, internally consistent worldview where everything had meaning and everything connected to everything else. They were wrong about animal facts, but they were trying to understand a deeper truth about how the cosmos worked and what humans' place in it was. When medieval people encountered real animals that contradicted bestiary descriptions, they didn't necessarily abandon the bestiary. They might conclude the real animal was an aberrant example, or they might assume they were observing incorrectly, or they might compartmentalize, maintaining both the bestiary belief and the observed reality without seeing contradiction. This seems irrational to modern scientific thinking, but medieval epistemology wasn't about matching observations to hypotheses. It was about fitting everything into a God-ordained structure of meaning. The bestiary preserved that structure. Raw observations sometimes disrupted it. When those conflicted, the structure often won because the alternative was chaos. A universe without inherent meaning or purpose. The gradual replacement of bestiaries with empirical zoology took centuries and wasn't complete until the scientific revolution. Even then, some bestiary elements persisted. The shift wasn't just about better observation techniques. It was a fundamental change in what people thought animals were for. Were they moral lessons, or were they biological organisms? Medieval people mostly answered both. Modern people mostly answer the latter. That's a profound shift in worldview, not just accumulated knowledge. And that concludes our journey through medieval peoples. Relationships with animals. A relationship that was simultaneously practical and mystical, cruel and reverent, systematic and completely bizarre. From animals on trial to animals as medicine to animals as symbols of divine truth, medieval people saw animals as far more than just animals. They were fellow creatures in a cosmos saturated with meaning, where even the smallest sparrow and the strangest mythical beast played a role in the grand drama of creation, sin, and redemption.